Hello, my name is Kimberly Dienes, and I'm a lecturer in clinical and health psychology at Swansea University. Today, I'm going to present data collected in collaboration with my American doctoral student, Alison A. Sarge, for her dissertation on the impact of type and frequency of childhood adversity on the cortisol awakening response. We are looking at the ways that stress gets under the skin over time. In this case, how specific types of stress experienced before the age of 15 might change your biology such that you don't have the resources to deal well with daily stressors later in life. One metabolic resource is the cortisol awakening response, which helps us deal with stressors of the day. If we can identify children who experience specific types of adversity that may change our biology long term, we can intervene early to prevent these biological changes in the stress response system. Briefly, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal or HPA axis is an essential component of this biological stress response system. Long-term repeated activation of the HPA axis may lead to allostatic load, which is wear and tear on the body, that contributes to negative clinical and health outcomes such as depression, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and chronic fatigue syndrome. One way to measure HPA axis functioning, and therefore allostatic load, is the stress hormone cortisol, which is one of its endpoints, which we measure in saliva. Cortisol is secreted in a daily or diurnal rhythm, and part of that rhythm is this big spike in the morning here, called the cortisol awakening response, or CAR. The CAR is thought to be both a response to the stress of awakening and to give you a needed metabolic boost to deal with the stresses of the day ahead. A flat or blunted CAR has been associated with same-day fatigue and stress, and a blunted trait CAR, so repeated CAR over time, has been linked to chronic disorders such as depression, PTSD, and CFS, among other outcomes. Some of our other research looks at multi-locus genetic profiles that interact with childhood adversity to predict the CAR and negative mood and fatigue in adolescence. Research investigating the effects of childhood adversity on psychological functioning and biological stress processes has shown that adults who experience adversity are more likely to have HPA axis dysregulation, but there has yet to be a clear consensus on the nature and directionality of that dysregulation. So hypersecretion or hyposecretion of cortisol, whether H is associated with childhood adversity. Childhood adversity is unfortunately very common, 30 to 70% of the population in research studies, and is defined as enduring experiences in a child's life prior to the age of 15 that are aversive for most children based on empirical research and that affect the child's well-being. These experiences include some of the following life events for the purposes of this study. We've separated them into two different types. Childhood adversity involving victimization, which is defined as harmful treatment by another person, such as abuse, neglect, and bullying, has stronger negative implications for psychopathology and overall functioning in existing research than non-victimization events here, such as parental substance abuse and death of a close other. So childhood adversity involving non-victimization involves more kind of traumatic events, short or long. The current study investigates whether childhood adversity involving victimization may differ in the degree or nature of HPA axis dysregulation from childhood adversity involving non-victimization. And specifically, so we predict that the type of childhood adversity will differentially predict the CAR, such that childhood adversity involving victimization will be associated with an unhealthy or blunted CAR that's been linked to negative clinical and health outcomes in past research, whereas non-victimization events will be linked to either a normal or an elevated CAR. Participants were 55 undergraduates ranging in age from 18 to 46, attending a small Midwestern university in America. They were very ethnically diverse, represented as Southside Chicago population and 67% female. Exclusion criteria are here, and they are listed, they're characteristic of cortisol studies. Salivary samples were collected using salvats at waking, 30 and 60 minutes post-waking to capture the CAR across 2 days in keeping with CAR best practice. Assays were conducted using time-resolved immunoassay with fluorescence detection, and intra- and inter-assay coefficients of variance have been reported at below 12 for the lab where we conducted the assays. CAR was calculated using trapezoidal formulas, as you can see here, for area under the curve with respect to ground. So this is your CAR here, this is respect to ground, and then with respect to increase, so that would be with respect to waking, so that's AUCI. And then also the peak, which is waking to peak, the outcome variables. So victimization adversity, or adversity inflicted on the child by another, was measured using the Life Experiences Questionnaire by Brandon Gibb. It's specifically designed to measure this type of adversity. So it examines whether or not the event occurred, the frequency, age of onset and offset, and again really focuses on bullying, neglect, kind of interpersonal victimization events. Non-victimization adversity, or events that happen to the child but are not directed at the child, was measured using a modified version of Fink's childhood trauma interview, which we call the childhood adversity questionnaire. So again, it's presence or absence, age of onset or offset, and frequency of events. We calculated ratios for each questionnaire so that we could compare the two instead of the actual number of events and frequency of events. So all the data are reported as ratios. As you can see, multiple linear regression analyses revealed that contrary to prediction, non-victimization events here were predictive of the CAR for both number and frequency events. You see number here, but it's also for frequency rather than victimization events. And we're predictive of the flat or blunted CAR we predicted for victimization. There has been past research that shows that it's childhood trauma, not adversity, that's more predictive of long-term biological changes, and the childhood trauma, with these kind of severe events that happen, is more related to our non-victimization category. So I think this is a great area for future research. Now, what's interesting is we also found that the interaction of victimization and non-victimization events predicted the cortisol awakening response. So a normal CAR is a 2 to 3-fold elevation in cortisol. We really didn't get that with our sample, as you can see here as much, possibly because minorities held below cortisol due to allostatic load. Separate topic, had some really interesting results, but that might be what we're seeing here. But what you can see is that individuals with a high number of victimization events and a low number of non-victimization events had this blunted AUCG that we've predicted, okay? However, it's also individuals with low victimization and high non-victimization that have the more blunted CAR. It's possible it isn't specifically non-victimization events that are predicted of blunted CAR, but when there is a difference or this interaction in the type of adversity or kind of inconsistency. So in childhood literature, we know that inconsistency is one of the hardest things for children psychologically. And it might be that when a child has, for example, a secure home environment, suddenly loses a parent. So for example, low victimization and high non-victimization, or is victimized but doesn't experience any acute trauma. So that kind of difference is where we see the changes in the HP axis over time. So our limitations are that we had a very small sample to look at interactions. Surprising that we found any, but we would like to look at this in a larger sample. Also, I don't love the CAQ, the questionnaire that we use for non-victimization events. It does get at things, but not as well as Gibbs LEQ. So I would think that the study should be run with a more kind of comparable questionnaire, so a detailed childhood adversity questionnaire that looks at different types of adversity, specifically those kind of more non-victimization trauma events. And I'd love some suggestions here, if there are any out there that compare both the kind of more adverse kind of harm to the child and non-victimization events. So in conclusion, non-victimization events were predictive of a blunted CAR, contrary to hypothesis. It might be that childhood trauma more than childhood adversity is linked to long-term changes in the HP axis. However, we also found that the interaction effect, where a high number and frequency of both types of adversity was predicted of a blunted CAR, but only when there was a lower amount or a low number of the other types of adversity. So perhaps it's when adversity is inconsistent that it can lead to long-term changes in the biological stress response system. We need to look into the timing and the type of childhood adversity more to understand how it can get under the skin to change our ability to respond to future stressors in adulthood. Thank you for your time.